The Berlin Wall, the most oppressive symbol of the Cold War, not only divided the city of Berlin, but symbolized the division of the entire world. So great was the debate over the city that in the years following World War II, the East Germans began to flee for the West, and the overarching influences of the US and the USSR would forever shape not only the country of Germany, but also the continent of Europe and the post-war world. The Second World War had ravaged the entire continent of Europe. The victorious Allies met in Potsdam in July of 1945 to discuss how Germany would be treated after the war, how the denazification process would be held, provided provisions about how much money was to be spent in the reconstruction of Germany, and where the dividing lines would be set. It became clear the Western Allies and the Soviet Union did not see eye to eye on the issues surrounding Germany. The stage was set for the division of the country, the continent, and the differing political ideologies. It was agreed upon that the Soviets would control the East and most of Berlin. However, the Western Allies insisted that they would not part with the symbolic German capital, even though the Soviets took Berlin in the war. Thus, a Western enclave of the city existed deep within the Soviet zone. In 1948, George Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State, proposed the Marshall Plan, a gift of U.S. funds to the crippled war-torn Western powers, along with implementing the German mark. It effectively began the process to jumpstart the German economy toward free market capitalism. Stalin, however, was angered that the U.S. had turned its back on the agreement in Potsdam, and as a result, the Soviets refused the money offered to the Eastern Bloc countries. This brewing tension led to an 11-month ordeal beginning in June of 1948, commonly known as the Berlin Airlift. The Soviets cut off the autobahn leading to West Berlin in an attempt to gain full control of the city via starvation. The Allies responded by flying supplies non-stop into Berlin. Stalin's attempt to keep West Berlin under the thumb of the Eastern Bloc had failed, and the blockade of the city was lifted in May of 1949. At the onset of the 1950s, tensions between East and West sparked another critical conflict between the superpowers and another divided nation, Korea. The Korean War was the first of many East Asian conflicts that were to come about due to the U.S. fear of communism spreading, known as the domino effect. This fear was so great that in May of 1955, West Germany was urged to join NATO to solidify the situation in Europe. A few days later, the DDR was forced into the Warsaw Pact by the USSR to match the West move, while both sides were busy stockpiling nuclear weapons. Not only was the DDR forced into the pact, it was also in the middle of the worst economic downturn since the early 1920s. This forced many Easterners to emigrate to the West. Most of the citizens lost to the West were young Germans wishing to find better schooling and work opportunities. The Soviet Union, like the US, was trying to look more powerful than their counterpart, and this did not bode well with either the DDR or the Kremlin. The governments had to act. The beginning of the 1960s dawned a new era in American politics with the election of President John F. Kennedy. The young and dynamic president was barely in office for more than 3 months when he ordered the Bay of Pigs. This was a complete and utter failure for the U.S. This not only was a major boost for the USSR in terms of publicity, but it provided an opportunity to seal on the Warsaw Pact. The USSR convened with Walter Ulbricht, the General Secretary of the DDR, on what to do about the mass exodus of people. With the USSR in control, plans for a wall began.
Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer zu errichten.
No one has the intention of building a wall, was the statement to the East German people and the world. The Sunday of the 13th of August 1961 became known throughout Germany, both East and West, as Barbed Wire Sunday, as the wall was erected. Many Easterners realized this could be their last chance at freedom. Leaping from apartments on Bernauer Strasse down to the pavement below, they used desperate measures to escape. And one East German in particular would become the center of international attention. Peter Fester attempted to scale the early construct of the Berlin Wall. Peter's luck ran dry as he was cut down in a hail of bullets. American soldiers on the west side provided no aid to the bleeding Fester, as they did not want to start a conflict with the East German border troops. The same was true for the border guards themselves. In all the commotion of the international tension, Peter bled to death. The West Germans were outraged that such an action was taken on both sides. They felt as though they were mere pawns in someone else's chess match. Later that year, in October, an American diplomat was halted before entering East Berlin. This was in direct opposition to the Potsdam Agreement of 1945, which agreed to let diplomats be immune to such stops by German police. General Lucius Clay, wanting to test the Soviets, sent in another diplomat the following day, who again was halted and denied entry. Soviet tanks were called in, and American tanks followed suit. A standoff had begun that could lead directly to the Third World War. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed that they must withdraw the tanks, which diffused the situation. Although it was almost the start of the Third World War, the West Germans respected Clay's actions, a small silver lining to what could have been nuclear winter. With the situation becoming more strenuous in Berlin for both sides, the year 1961 came and passed, and in October 1962 the tension in Berlin would reach fever pitch. The U.S. discovered Russian nuclear missiles that had been secretly transported to Cuba. With Kennedy's recent failures in Cuba and Berlin in 1961, Khrushchev wanted to see if he could push the young and inexperienced president. This discovery had changed Kennedy's entire outlook. Not only did he have the Soviet missiles in his backyard, he had the threat if he revealed the missiles were there and demanded their removal, he could tip the balance of power and kick off World War III. The situation was extremely delicate. After several days of hard debate within his own administration, he revealed to the world the missiles in Cuba, risking all that the Western powers had gained in Europe and increasing the threat of nuclear war yet again. However, after several close incidents and a blockade of Cuba, the crisis was averted when both sides agreed to withdraw missiles from bases on each other's frontiers. Later, on the 26th of June 1963, Kennedy gave a speech in Berlin, commonly known as the Ich bin ein Berliner speech. It solidified the American commitment to the struggle of West Berlin. The speech had such a profound effect on the morale of the West Germans that the square where Kennedy gave the speech was renamed in his honor. But as U.S. forces prepared for war in Vietnam, the USSR and DDR continued strengthening their hold on the Eastern Bloc by reinforcing the wall. By the start of the 1970s, the three Western allies and the Soviet Union signed the Four Power Agreement on Berlin. This allowed West German citizens living in West Berlin to freely travel from east to west and vice versa using a visa. Of course, the East German guards did not always grant admittance, especially after several successful escape attempts in the trunks of cars. And the process of obtaining these visas was made nearly impossible for the Easterners. As the DDR cut off more and more contact with the West due to Soviet influence, coal became the sole power source. It badly polluted the land, making the DDR one of the most polluted countries in all of Europe. However, the West used cleaner energy, and in combination with trade agreements with other NATO countries, West Germany prospered. By the start of the 1980s, there were major differences in the quality of life on both sides of the wall. The U.S. supplied economy of the Marshall Plan some 40 years earlier was churning out BMWs, Adidas sneakers, and Bayer aspirin for the world market, whereas the Soviet-backed command economy of the DDR had a waiting list for up to 10 years for a single Trabant, a small East German two-cylinder car. With similar bouts of economic hardship in the USSR, the new Soviet premier Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985. Beginning in 1986 with Perestroika, he encouraged reform within the Eastern Bloc and USSR. In one aspect, the DDR differed from the other Eastern Bloc nations. The DDR was not a single theocratic state that destroyed churches and banned free worship. This allowed people throughout the 1980s to organize environmental groups to protest the government's irresponsible use of the land. Finally, in the summer of 1989, the Hungarian government opened its borders with Austria, leaving a gap to which citizens of the DDR could seek asylum into the West. Thousands poured out into the West following the loophole. The DDR needed to act in order to keep its citizenry, and its plan to make visas much more obtainable than ever before. Unfortunately for the government, a typo on the official report detailing the time to begin to issue visas was misinterpreted to be effective immediately, rather than over the next few weeks. By the evening of the 9th of November, thousands of East Berliners stormed unprepared guards at crossing points along the wall. The wall was crumbling. The East German people would not live with constant oppression and low quality of life. Within a year, the Easterners forced the government to offer fair elections. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl was welcomed into the East to thousands of cheering fans, and paraded for his party in East Germany. He called for the possible reunification of Germany, but Washington was outraged that he would call for a reunification so soon because Gorbachev's feelings were so unclear. The world waited with bated breath. Surprisingly, Gorbachev was for reunification and the permanent destruction of the wall. This set in motion the removal of the DDR from the Eastern Bloc and its reunification with the West under a year after the Curtain of Concrete was lifted on October 3, 1990. 40 years of conflict and strife over multiple borders, languages, cultures, and ideologies had ended in the blink of an eye. The Curtain of Concrete between East and West would be removed, and similar reforms to that in Germany took place throughout all of the Eastern Bloc. Germany was the catalyst, the center of the world's attention. When the superpowers had nukes pointed at each other, the Curtain of Concrete was at the head of the debate.